What happened?
Ryan asked me to clean his office.
No, why is there a fire?
Never throw water on a grease fire.
Why was there a grease fire?
He has too many questions.
Okay.
How would you know? How would you know not to throw? It's water. It's supposed to stop it.
Fire is a common element in film. Regardless of the genre, it's a great brushstroke thematically for intensity, and it just looks incredibly cinematic. It's also an element that, if done well, can up your production value, but if not, it'll pull your audience out of the story. So, similar to our Rain episode, we wanted to use some stock assets to set fire to my office as convincingly as possible. And comping stock assets or simulating CG fire is much more commonplace now, and it definitely has its benefits, like no one dying, for instance. Plus, there's budget, not having to worry about property damage or laws or getting specialists, fire department involved, and so on. However, sometimes it can be pretty easy to tell the difference between fake and practical fire. Comped fire can often have a more flat look, retaining a lot of details in the highlights, whereas practically shot fire often clips, since those areas are almost always heavily overexposed compared to the subjects in the scene. They also can have an unnatural glow, strong heat waves, embers, and can lean quite far toward orange. With this in mind, we looked at a lot of practical fire for references. Each one of these does have a different look. This can be down to how it was shot, such as exposure, film or digital, how the color was handled in post, and of course the type of fire itself. Some of these even change their looks between shots, but we ended up focusing on these few references for the look we wanted. Now, while we aren't shooting the fire practically, we can and should still do as much in camera as possible, and that will be done with fog and lighting. For the lighting, we grabbed a few of our tube lights and set them at different points in the room where we wanted our fire to be at. Now, most of these types of lights do have effects built in, like a fire flicker effect, but for me, the fire effects are never very convincing. So to get the look that we were after, I used two lights for each area. One that would be a constant orange and one that would have a consistent flicker. That way, I have a solid, consistent glow from the fire and a slight flicker introduced behind that. For the fog, we are just using a normal fog machine. Anything will work for this. Grab something from a party store or off Amazon and you're good to go. The only trick here is toying around with how the fog moves through the room to get the look that you want, which was just trial and error for me. Now, you could do all of that digitally, but if you do go the compositing route with the light and smoke, it would be a tough process to get a natural look. Fog and smoke catch, diffuse, and spread light and has a density which can obscure the background, so you can't just set a stock footage clip of smoke to add or screen. It's also volumetric, so depending on the complexity of your scene, you'll have to basically create a depth map of various foreground elements. Digital lighting can also be very difficult to make work as well, and with any visual effect, getting as much in camera as you can will always make the digital elements more grounded. So with everything set, we shot multiple takes with various levels of smoke density and ended up choosing this version here. In After Effects, drop the footage into a new comp, and since this is a moving shot, we're going to do a 3D camera track. Once that's done, we'll select a point where some of the fire will be and create a null in camera. We also created a null at the start area as well, since we'll be adding more fire here. Now duplicate the footage to be our desk and create a solid layer above to be the desk mat. Make it 3D and copy paste a position from the first null to place the solid in this area. For our desk, we'll make sure it's scaled larger than the comp height so that during the pan, the mat will not cut off at the bottom. We'll hide the visibility and use the pen tool to draw around the desk and any other foreground objects such as the speaker and cables, then feather slightly, set the desk footage below to alpha matte to isolate the desk, enable motion blur, then skim through and keyframe the mask to change if needed, since slight lens distortion on the pan can make masks misaligned a bit. There's plenty of more to do, we just got started, but before I do want to thank today's sponsor, which is Motion Array. Motion Array is a whole toolbox of things, with the most obvious thing being their massive library of assets like video templates, stock footage, photo, music, and sound effects, like title cards that you see in most of our recent episodes. Title Title cards can be time consuming to make from scratch, which time is something that we pretty much never have. So we could search for what we're looking for here and get a bunch of options. And if we want to dive further into one like the templates, we could click see all, and here we have templates for After Effects, Premiere, Final Cut, and Resolve. So we can go to software specific until we find the one that we like, which for us is this one here. So now with that After Effects template, we could either use it as a starting point or we can customize it heavily. Or if we're in a rush, we can just change the text and use it as is. And that quickly and simply, we have some nice graphics for our show. We could also go back and dive into the other categories like presets, things like transitions, text presets, and even LUTs. What I really love about a site like this with so many different types of assets is it can also serve as inspiration. Sometimes just browsing things that are in the lane of what you are doing will spark ideas of what you could do. So you may not even have your finger fully on what you want, but you can search in that general area and scroll toward inspiration. But there's a lot more to Motion Array than even that. Here you have their plugins. This is a bunch of different transitions and effects to use inside of Premiere. Download and install and find them in your effects folder. Then you have a great collaboration tool that comes with the subscription. You can upload your work to send and receive notes to help with remote work. And finally, a site builder. In their portfolio builder, you can make your own site to show off your work and use a custom URL to make it fully yours and pro. So it really is that Swiss Army knife for filmmakers. And for subscriptions, you have annual, which saves you some cash, or monthly so that you can grab it when you need it only per project. And these are all one universal license to cover you for whatever you're working on. So if you make content of any kind, this is for you. So jump into the links below and check this one out for yourself.
Logo.
For our main fire, we'll be using the Big Fire 2 asset from Video Copilot's Action Essentials 2-pack. Drop it beneath the desk footage and make it a 3D layer. Once again, paste the null position, then change position and scale. We'll mask this area here and set it to subtract to remove it, then enable motion blur. We can slide it in the timeline to find a section that works best for our shot too. Then set the blending mode to screen. Based on our footage, we will use a tint effect at around 40% to lower the saturation, a curves effect to lower the highlights, and a hue and saturation to shift the orange tone slightly toward yellow, though this depends on which dominant color you're going for as well as the fire assets themselves. We could also see the chair here through the flames, which does look a bit unnatural. So to fix this, we can duplicate the fire and on the bottom layer, set the blending mode back to normal, remove the effects except for the tint, change the amount to 100, and use the color picker to select a warm area from our scene. Do this again for the other color. This makes the fire asset a solid color and blocks background sections like the chair from being visible. Of course, you can mask just this section or keep it as is. We do have a frame poster behind glass on this wall here where we would see a reflection of the fire if it was physically in the room. To add this, we can duplicate our desk mat solid and delete the masks. Now move it over to the frame and rotate. Hide visibility, mask inside the frame and feather slightly. Duplicate the fire and move it beneath the poster matte solid. Set to alpha matte and move the position to frame it where it feels correct for reflection. Next, alter the curves effect to lower the exposure and we'll add a fast box blur with a low value to tone down the sharpness. We'll also add a reflection to the desk surface. So duplicate the fire again and place above the desk layer, move the anchor point to around the edge of the desk, flip it vertically, and we'll delete the mask. Now use a duplicate of the desk mat above to isolate it, deleting and altering the masks to just keep the desk surface area. We'll also draw a few new masks set to subtract like the edge of the desk, the speaker, and reflection with a higher feather as this will block the visibility of the fire. Once again, keyframe through the shot if needed. Now you could use a fast box blur, but for a more detailed look, you can use a texture to get a gloss roughness effect. So we'll delete the blur, remove the alpha matte for now, duplicate our camera and pre-comp this fire and camera together as our desk reflection and set it back to screen. Using a free texture as a 3D layer, we're going to change the scale, position, and rotation to roughly match the perspective of the desk, and once again, duplicate the camera to pre-comp with this texture as our desk texture map. We'll use a tint effect to make it black and white and a curves to change the contrast, then hide the visibility. On the desk reflection, set it back to alpha matte and add a compound blur, selecting the desk reflection map as the blur layer and choosing effects and masks. Now increase the blur as much or as little as you'd like depending on the material of the surface that you're trying to replicate. You can also change the curves effect to control how strong or subtle the roughness is, and go into the texture comp to rearrange the placement to see how the texture affects the reflection, giving us this. Now we'll move to the start of the shot and add some fire to the floor, this time using the Burning Debris 4 asset from Action VFX. Once again, we're going to drop it in and make it a 3D layer with motion blur enabled. Copy and paste the other null location and change the position, rotation, and scale, as well as move it in the timeline. Set to screen, and again, use a tint to lower the saturation and a curves to lower the exposure. We're going to duplicate and place below the desk footage layer and move the position over to beneath the desk. Then swap it out for another fire. We opted for the Burning Debris 7 asset, again from Action VFX, lining up the placement how we like and using a mask to keep this area. Then we duplicated again, changing the mask and moving over to the left to combine with the previous layer. For the last fire asset, we duplicated the first one, brought it to above the other fire layers, and swapped it out to the Big Fire 1 Action Essentials 2 asset. Once again, changing scale, position, rotation, and timing. We'll duplicate and set the lower one to normal again, and copy and paste the tint effect from earlier to make it solid below the screen layer. And it can be tempting to add a lot of heat distortion to fire shots, but again, if we look at our practical references, it doesn't actually seem to be so common. However, we will add a little bit of heat first with this front fire here. So duplicate the fire and camera to pre-comp as a front fire map and hide visibility. Inside the comp, delete the fire effects and add a new curves to boost the alpha channel and a blur to soften it. Now create a black solid for the background, then go back to the main comp. Create an adjustment layer for the heat effects and place it beneath the front fire layers. Use a vector blur and select the fire front map as the vector map. We can hide the top fire layers to see what this is actually doing. And now changing the amount will create a distortion and blur look, and you can also change the type for different styles. If your effect is near an edge, you might get this here. So use a motion tile effect placed first, set to mirror edges and increase the height, giving us this instead. With the fire back on, we can see it's a subtle effect, but it does help it tie in a bit. You can also do this for the other fire layers if needed. With the backfire, it is affecting the desk edge. So for this, we can copy and paste the desk map into the fire map comp, enable visibility, move it up a bit, and add a subtle blur until there is no more distortion over the desk. These steps are all pretty customizable depending on the look that you're going for. We wanted to brighten up the room in areas too around the fire, so above the base footage, we're going to use an adjustment layer set to 3D, and then we're going to mask this area with a high feather. Using a curves effect will boost the brightness as well as the red in the shadows and lower the blue. We'll duplicate this and move it over to the start area as well, altering the curve slightly and lowering opacity. Above everything, we'll create an adjustment layer to add a glow or haze. We'll be using Red Giant's optical glow with a low amount, boosted size, highlights only, roll off, and vibrance. Then use a curves effect to add contrast before lowering the layer opacity. Now duplicate this layer, boost opacity, and change some of the glow settings, including adding a warm color to the glow. Duplicate this again, and now we'll change the X and Y glow sizes individually to create a horizontal glow streak. Sometimes you can see in fire shots the surrounding areas can be pretty dark in contrast to the flames. So to get a similar look, we'll use a new adjustment layer with a curves effect to darken everything up, then another layer above this to boost the highlights. A way to make the highlights pop is by using a camera lens blur effect. Set the blur to 0 and use the highlight gain and threshold values to choose how much and how bright we want this element in our shot. We then used a hue and saturation effect to shift more toward yellow slightly, and to get another wash of glow, we duplicated one of the adjustment layers, moved it to the top, and lowered opacity. If you want to add a slight halation look to the edges of the desk, you can use a separate glow with a low size set to an orange color and use a copy of the desk map above that to use as an alpha. We also added a subtle lens texture over the shot, and after our final grade and sound, we have this. I think the key here, or for any organic element that you're trying to digitally comp in, is references. Finding images that can be your guide in landing the most realistic look possible. And of course, doing as much practically as possible before you ever get into post. So give it a shot for yourself. Links to the assets we used in the notes below. And as always, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.